Cleaning up the mess, Volkswagen bosses discuss how to deal with the emissions rigging scandal. The company has already lost billions of its share price. And how is the rest of the global automobile industry affected? And what about the true pollution levels? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mike Hanna. Top executives of the world's biggest car maker, Volkswagen, have been huddled in a crisis meeting in their German headquarters. The company has admitted to intentionally fitting 11 million diesel cars with devices designed to cheat emission test results. But more importantly, it's cost Volkswagen a loss of faith in the brand. Earning back consumer trust will not be easy. Rob Reynolds takes a closer look at the scandal.
With his company accused of serious and deliberate deception, Volkswagen chief executive Martin Winterkorn apologized and said such manipulation would never happen again.
Ladies and gentlemen, many millions of people across the world trust our brands, our cars and our technologies. I'm endlessly sorry that we betrayed the trust. I apologize profusely to our clients, to the authorities and the entire public for the wrongdoing.
The scandal has shaken German industry.
We were all pretty surprised about that, and it's kind of a catastrophe, not only for Volkswagen, it's a catastrophe for all the German car makers, and it's bad even for the brand made in Germany, because Volkswagen is one of our really big brands that stand for German quality.
Even Chancellor Angela Merkel was forced to address the stunning instance of corporate deceit.
The Minister of Transport is in close contact with the VW company, and I hope that the facts will be put on the table as quickly as possible.
U.S. officials found Volkswagen installed software in its diesel vehicles that tricked emissions tests into giving the cars a passing grade, even though they emitted more pollution while on the road. The company issued a statement saying 11 million vehicles are affected. It has set aside 6.5 billion euros for recalls and servicing, and it says Volkswagen does not tolerate violation of laws and will make winning back consumer trust its top priority. Unlike other auto recalls involving design flaws or defective parts, Volkswagen is accused of deliberately hatching a technologically sophisticated scheme to deceive government agencies and consumers. Damage control experts say the nature of the scheme will make regaining trust much harder.
I think whenever you have a situation where something is calculated and malicious and there is a desire to deceive, the half-life is longer for recovery.
On Wednesday, a committee of Volkswagen's board members and major shareholders will hold an emergency meeting. A board member says he expects senior company heads will roll. Rob Reynolds, Al Jazeera, Berlin.
Well, the brand Volkswagen means far more than simply a car. For decades, it's been synonymous with a certain lifestyle. Owners of a Volkswagen had very close connection and pride associated with their vehicles, dating back to World War II era with the People's Wagon. The Beetle, as it became known, was just one of the options. Another was an icon of the 1970s counterculture movement, Volkswagen's Type 2 Combi, dubbed the hippie van. It was a familiar sight at the American music festival Woodstock in 1969. The vehicles went on to become a symbol of the youth culture throughout the 70s, 80s, and even up to today. Well, now let's bring in our guests. Joining us in London, Nick Gibbs, he's correspondent for Automotive News Europe. In Oxford, Neil Baumann, researcher of climate physics at Oxford University. And in Bremen, Germany, via Skype, we have Axel Friedrich. He is the former head of transportation. Welcome to you all. Well, details are emerging of a pattern of intentional deceit that began when emission levels were first questioned well over a year ago. Certainly cannot be dismissed as what Volkswagen originally described as a technical glitch. Nick Gibbs, this is something that has been in place for what seems to be a lengthy period of time, has it not?
It seems like it was there since 2009 when Volkswagen first launched this family of engines in the States. But it's only just been discovered now. That the family of engines is now on its way out, but it affects 500,000 cars in the States, and Volkswagen now said that the software is also fitted to cars in Europe, although we don't know how many of those 11 million cars will actually be affected by any future action.
Well, Neil Baumann, once again, we're looking at the States. Some 4% of cars there are in fact diesel, but in Europe, a very different picture. Some half of cars on the road in Europe are in fact diesel types. So this is a particular concern for those in Europe and other parts of the world, is it not?
Yes. So what we see here is that the results that we were finding in the test beds where these vehicles were tested were far, far lower than the results we saw on the road. And in fact, a recent report by Transport and Environment suggested that the road condition emissions of nitrous oxide were 7 times higher than the legal limit that had been allowed. And it was these deceit devices that were allowing that to occur. A report this morning suggested that we have had 11 million tons worldwide of additional nitrous oxide emissions as a result of this coming out of this Volkswagen investigation. And this is the equivalent of total UK emissions from industry, transportation and power plants. So that gives you a sense of the amount of nitrous oxide emissions that were being hidden by these deceit devices and were not being reported.
Yes, just to add to that, Neil, the actual degree of pollution some are estimating is well over 20 times the emission levels of Western Europe's biggest power station. So this is a massive, massive problem. Axel Friedrich, this is not just about brand Volkswagen. It is also, it seems, about brand Germany, is it not?
Not only Germany, it's nearly all diesel manufacturers around the world using the same simple question: how you can solve the problem to reduce emissions but not spending too much money. And therefore it's not a Volkswagen problem, it's a problem that we have no real control of in-use emissions around the world. It's not only here, it's everywhere the same. So it's not Volkswagen. I think it's a misunderstanding. It's not a Volkswagen problem, it's a problem that we have no real in-use control. It's an enforcement problem, because if one manufacturer is doing this, it was not the first one, Volkswagen, as I followed, because if you have no control, everybody is doing the same. Otherwise, you're losing on the market because you are not competitive. And that, I think, is a problem.
Well, Neil Baumann, we're looking at the situation where once we are stating it, not just the United States, but if the United States had not picked this up, the EPA and in fact the California car testing company that did so a number of years ago, they could still be driving around Europe with nobody the wiser, could they not?
Yes. The particular problem for VW in the US is that they failed to declare that they were using these deceit devices on their cars. Indeed, in Europe, it's been less of a problem, but that's simply because of the existing regulations that we have in place. So back in July, the European Commission said that by 2017, they would ideally like to update these standards and bring them more into modern times. So make it so that they were being tested on the road rather than in testbed conditions, and to use more modern technology in this testing. And so that would hopefully resolve some of these problems. But yes, indeed, if it had not been picked up by the EPA, this problem could have continued for a long time.
Well, Nick Gibbs, at fault, we understand, is something rather gloriously titled dual calibration software. Essentially, that is a software within the vehicles that does react differently on the road as it would in a testing situation on a dynamometer. So certainly we are looking at something that has been embedded in car culture in a way that testing is done on dynos. You do have advances in technology where cars react differently under testing circumstances than they do on the open road. This is a problem, is it not?
It is a problem, and it has been a problem for some time. What we're seeing with VW in the States is something new, is that the conditions that they achieve on the dynometer is not something they can ever replicate on the roads, whereas in the EU, it's more a case that they tune the car for the test. And if you did go out on the roads and drove delicately as per some very outdated test cycles, you could actually achieve what the car company said they were going to achieve. But in the US, they've taken it one step further, because this so-called defeat device only worked in the test bed. It understood that it was in a testing environment through a variety of different parameters. It knew from the ECU, it knew that the front wheels weren't steering, for example. That's one possible way that it could know. And to be honest, manufacturers have been gaming this system quite a lot, and to be fair, that has been the fault of these outdated tests, as I said, and as has been mentioned, there has been a move to make them more reflective of how we actually drive. Nobody drives like they do in a test situation, but you have to have a repeatable situation within these test environments. Otherwise, how are you going to compare models? I think VW have certainly raised the game here, and it'll be interesting to see whether, if anybody, has been doing something similar.
Axel Friedrich, you mentioned the issue of cost. Is this just highlighting the fact that diesel operating effectively and cleanly does just cost too much to operate? Is that a broad supposition?
I think I have to add one point before. It's not a new thing. I'm dealing with issues in 30 years. It's not a new thing. It's not only used in diesel, it's also used in other cars. It's a quite common issue. Why we have higher CO2 emission on the road than we have on a dyno? Why we have earlier time switch off the lambda zone? This is completely an issue we had running behind the manufacturer since a very long time. Not only in Europe, also in the United States. So it's not a new issue. So I really think why people are surprised. It's an issue which is going around since a long time. In former time, it was simple switches. Now it's in electronics. But it exists. And the problem is the enforcement was not good enough. And the issue was not discovered in the United States. Clearly it was discovered in Europe. Only because we have also tested 3 American cars. This was the reason why EPA stepped in. It was a study done by ICT in Europe and not in the United States. So clearly, I think people have to understand it's not a problem of Volkswagen, it's a problem of manufacturers generally. It's not only diesel cars, it's also gasoline cars. I think we need a different culture, how we control cars. We have now worked in Europe on a new procedure, how to test cars on the road, but it took too long time. We know since years it was a need for such a test. And still, we have not decided what limits should be done, what the introduction time. All these things are still open. So clearly we need a different understanding, what we would like to solve. We have problems for nitrogen dioxide in all European cities. And this is caused by 80% by diesel cars. And this is a problem. It's a health problem. It's not just annoyance. It's really a problem.
Apologies for interrupting, Axel Friedrich, but I want to go to Neil Baumann on that. You raise a very vital point there, that this is actually not just a mechanical problem, it is a major health problem that does more to do perhaps with the nature of the technology itself than a specific car manufacturer. Would you agree?
Somewhat. I think that there's been a clear case of deceit from Volkswagen in this case. And in fact, the California board that looks at air resources, they asked a number of other companies whether they use these deceit devices. Ford, BMW, Renault, Nissan all came back saying no. that they did not. The other car companies either declined to comment or said that simply that they met existing standards. And I think that this may be an issue that once we look into this a bit further, we'll realize that the definition of a deceit device is somewhat ambiguous. And so there's a bit of a sliding scale as to the extent to which you tune your cars specifically for these sorts of test conditions. Nonetheless, what we've found in Europe is that, again, from a recent report, 90% of diesel cars in Europe in road conditions fail to meet legal standards for nitrous oxide emissions. And so in that case, it is illustrating that this is a widespread issue in terms of cars not meeting emissions on road conditions. That's not illegal because they're tested in test conditions, but this really illustrates why we need to change the regulations and change the test conditions under which these tests are done.
Well, Nick Gibbs, we're also talking about nitrous dioxide, which is a deeply poisonous gas. But to return to that question of the technology, is the technology now outdated? Are we in a scenario where there are better alternatives? This type of situation highlights the fact that we should be looking at operating more cleanly, and that cost necessarily should not be a factor when it comes to the health of millions of people.
Well, there are better options, but they're expensive. We can go to electric cars, we can go to hybrid cars, but that adds a whole new level of complexity and cost to the actual price of the car. But we have to look at sort of what we want to achieve from the power plant in the car. Diesel has gained such huge traction in Europe because it's fantastic for CO2. It reduces the CO2 output of a car by 20-30% compared to a petrol equivalent, a gasoline equivalent, and that's too difficult to ignore. For a long time, governments in Europe, including here in the UK, were pushing ever lower CO2 cars as a way to meet climate change targets. And we're saying, well, we're going to abandon those targets now? Or are we going to say, okay, is the health of the people on the streets that's more important? It's really tough. It's really very, very difficult to say what's going to happen. And the car manufacturers themselves say, look, hey, you have asked us to reduce our emissions, our CO2 emissions, by 95 grams to 95 grams on average by 2020 in Europe. How are we going to achieve that if we can't use diesel? We have to use diesel, especially for the bigger cars, which are all, sort of 80-90% diesel sales. So what do you do? Okay, you can ensure that the diesel coming out, or the emissions coming out of the diesel cars are as clean as possible, and I think that's what needs to be done. We need to be assured that they're actually taking steps to make sure that the exhaust is being cleaned in a way that's acceptable to the big cities, especially like here in London and Paris, that are seeing rising NOx levels, nitrogen levels. So that has to be the target. Diesel is going to be with us for a long time. So let's make sure that it's as clean as possible, and please assure us that it is.
Well, Axel Friedrich, what do you think should be done? We heard that diesel's going to be with us for a long time. You say it's a wider problem than just what is emerging at the moment. What should be done, do you believe?
I disagree with the statement which was made before. We know with modern gasoline engines we can get the same CO2 emission than with diesel vehicles. This is clearly shown, and I have made own research on this, and if you want, I can share these results with you. The point is, of course, we know also how to clean up diesel. We have clean diesels. The particulates disappeared completely with the filter. We also know how to reduce the NO2, NOx emissions. So this is not the question. The question is clearly how we enforce this in real world. This is not the point. The technology is available to clean up diesels. And clearly, we have to do it. And it's not a question to discuss one side climate and one side health. We can have both. Even NO2 is adding to ozone, which also adds, of course, to the production of change of climate. So it's not an easy yes or no. We know we have to do it. We know how to do it. And if we can't do it, diesel has no role to play. Because at first, we have to protect the health of the people, nothing else.
Well, Neil Baumann, there we hear that we have to do it, but importantly, that we can do it. Why are we not doing it, I ask?
So some have said that it's a question of culture, and that in the US the thought is more that the Environmental Protection Agency shouldn't be allowed to regulate cars this stringently in terms of their nitrous oxide emissions. And so this culture then giving rise to things like these deceit devices. But we can see in cases like Japan, where they've been able to bring down their nitrous oxide emissions of their cars quite successfully, that this is something that we can definitely do. And so by changing these regulations, that's one way to help force these companies to help bring this down. To pick up on a previous point, this idea that diesel is cleaner than gas. While that's true on a pound for pound basis, what we often see is that diesel cars end up being made heavier because it's cheaper and in part. And so if you look at the average for diesel cars, it ends up being sort of similar or even higher than that of gas cars. But it depends on the metric in which you use for the comparison. So I'm not disagreeing with what was said earlier. Then the final point to make here is on nitrous oxide emissions, that these do in fact kill 400,000 people in the EU, and so we've seen a lot of work trying to get these down. But diesel cars are in fact the #1 polluter of nitrous oxide emissions in big cities like London. And so this is an issue we do need to tackle. And in terms of how we do this, the one technology I'm quite excited in this space is electric cars. You see that they don't emit, from the car at least, any of these sorts of emissions. And perhaps one good thing for the environment coming out of this is a lack of trust from environmentalists of diesel vehicles, meaning that we see more market share given to electric cars, which are coming on the market in their droves. And so perhaps there is a silver lining in all of this debacle after all.
Well, Nick Gibbs, there is a certain relationship between people who drive their cars and their vehicle, always has been. There's a particular form of symbiosis between the person and the vehicle that he or she is driving. And yet what we have here is that very trust being undercut. You mentioned, for example, the greener nature of diesel in the opinion of many. The people who are being insulted by this deception are those who are driving vehicles that they believe to be greener than straight gas-type versions. This just adds insult to injury, does it not?
Well, I think I disagree with you there. I think people who buy diesels in the main don't buy them for environmental reasons, especially here in Europe and probably in the States as well. You know, they're not sold as in the same way as electric cars are as being the environmental option. It's the governments that see them as the environmental option because of the low CO2. Those governments then almost impose them on people by saying, OK, if you buy one of these low CO2 cars, then you pay fewer taxes on them. So the people are like, hey, I'll buy anything that in the long run saves me money, and diesels are very good at that, you know, because they use less fuel. They mean that you can buy a sort of car you want, as opposed to, you know, a small super mini which might not fit your needs. They're good on they're low on taxes, and they drive well as well. I mean, the modern ones are very good to drive, and they give you a good feeling of power without being without using too much fuel. So, in the environmental aspect of it comes very low down on the list. And I would argue that VW's brand is looking quite tarnished at the moment. But ultimately, what they were doing was hoodwinking the government as opposed to the consumer. The consumer was getting a car that drove better. It had a better economy. It had more power because ultimately the systems used to clean up the NOx reduced both the economy and the power. So they were sort of looking after the consumer as it was. So, but it's tough. Diesel is not an environmental option in the minds of many. It's a good cash saving power or fuel that enables them to carry on motoring in the way they want to. Whether they should be allowed to is another question, but I drive a diesel myself, many other people do. If you're doing long distances, it's pretty much the only fuel there is that's still decent to use.
Well, it's a scandal that will continue to unravel, remembering too that criminal investigations may be launched in the United States against those responsible for this extended period of intentional deception. With this, my thanks to our guests, Nick Gibbs, Neil Bowerman, and Axel Friedrich. And thank you too for watching. Do send us your comments via the program page on our website, aljazeera.com. You can also post your views on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story or tweet us at AJ Inside Story. From me, Mike Hanna, and the whole team here, goodbye for now.